Hi, everyone. My name is Jack Chalman, and I'm head of strategy and communications at the Global Returns Project. Thank you so much to our panelists and our moderator for being here. And thanks to everyone who has already tuned in to this event. We had something like over 600 people register for the event, which is just fantastic. In just a moment, I will turn things over to our moderator, Natasha White. Natasha is a journalist at Bloomberg who's become a leading writer on ESG, offsetting, and the effects of the climate crisis. We're really grateful to have her involved. Before I hand things over, though, let me just quickly note that this event is hosted by the Global Returns Project. If you haven't come across our work before, we're a UK registered climate charity. We're helping individuals and businesses think beyond sustainability alone in both financial planning and corporate social responsibility. Our innovation is something called the Global Returns Portfolio, and that's the first portfolio of diverse, effective, and scalable not-for-profit organizations that are tackling climate change and curated by experts. These organizations regenerate the planet beyond the capacity of existing sustainability options. And so contributing to these organizations is a critical component to any individual's financial planning. And it's also a critical complement to any business's sustainability strategy. I'll make one last point. By regenerating the planet, our portfolio helps you or your business create a symbiotic relationship between the economy and the environment. In a few years' time, everyone will have moved from sustainability to symbiosis, and today you can stay ahead of the curve. Contribute to the portfolio on our website, globalreturnsproject.earth, and please do get in touch to learn more. Our email is info@globalreturnsproject.earth. We don't charge any fees to individuals or businesses, and we don't take any deductions from contributions. And now, without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Natasha.
Thanks, Jack, and hi, everyone. I'm excited to moderate this conversation today on what is a critical and very live topic. I've just been covering the World Economic Forum in Davos over the past few days. And there's been a lot of hype around carbon offsets as a climate solution. They were mentioned in almost every panel that I covered. We're seeing all kinds of actors pile into the space, but the market is really outrunning any form of regulation. And this really matters for this commodity more than any other due to its underlying environmental purpose. We've seen serious concerns regarding the integrity of the underlying offsets, for example, whether they represent true emissions reductions or removals or are simply so-called hot air. In which case they may have a net negative impact on the climate, as well as in terms of their impact on people and increasingly on biodiversity. So these are all topics that we'll hopefully cover today. So without further ado, on our panel of experts, we have Nathaniel Keohane, who is Senior Advisor to the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which grew out of the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market, which was set up by former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney. This is a multi-stakeholder body that for the past year or so has been working to establish a new threshold of standards for carbon offsets. We have Mark Stevenson, who is a strategic advisor to governments, NGOs and corporates, helping them to face the systemic challenges of our time and understand their role in meeting them. He is also a global ambassador for Client Earth, which is an environmental law nonprofit. And we have Dr. JOSE Maria Valenzuela, who is a research fellow at Oxford Net Zero, which is an interdisciplinary research institute at the University of Oxford in the UK. He works on global and comparative studies on decarbonisation and the energy transition, with an emphasis in emerging economies. So before we get started, just a brief housekeeping note to participants. That you can post questions in the Q&A using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we'll try to get to these at the end of this conversation. So we'll begin the conversation with a brief video introduction from Andrew McIntosh, who is Professor of Law at the Australian National University. This will last 8 minutes.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew McIntosh. I'm a lawyer and economist based at the Australian National University here in Canberra. I've been asked to talk to you today about the Australian Government's carbon offset scheme, known as the Emissions Reduction Fund, or the ERF. For some context, I have been involved in environmental markets for about 15 or so years and deeply involved in the Emissions Reduction Fund. Indeed, I was the chair of the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, which is the committee that sits over the offset methods that are used in the ERF. I've also been involved in multiple other government processes, including the thing called the King Review. I was a member of the Climate Change Authority. I was a Royal Commissioner on the Bushfire Royal Commission, which looked into the huge bushfires of 2019 and 2020. And I'm currently the project lead on a thing called the Agriculture Stewardship Program, which is a program that, amongst other things, is trying to integrate biodiversity and biodiversity payments into the carbon market. Now, I'm a huge believer in environmental markets and also in carbon offset markets. However, they carry risks. Carbon offsets, by their very nature, are a high-risk policy instrument. And the reason for that is that, firstly, the consequences of carbon credits being issued that have low integrity, that is, they don't represent real and additional abatement, are serious. If you get it wrong, then there's going to be two consequences. Firstly, it's going to result in an increase in emissions. That is, these things are used to offset an increase from somewhere else. So if there's no offsetting reduction, then you get the increase in emissions, but you don't get the reduction, so the environmental outcomes are worse. The other reason they're high risk is that it's very easy to get things wrong. Carbon offsets require the use of counterfactuals in order to measure abatement. By its definition, counterfactuals are high risk and it's very easy to get them wrong. The other thing is that a lot of offset activity tends to gravitate into areas where there's a significant amount of error associated with measurement. So in short, it's hard to get a carbon offset scheme that ensures that most of the carbon credits, if not all of them, are high integrity, and then the consequences of low integrity credits are significant. As a consequence of those factors, I'm a big believer that carbon offsets need to be focused and confined to areas where the risks of getting it wrong are low. So only allow carbon offsets from particular types of projects like, say, tree planting, revegetation, ecological restoration where the risks are low. And then secondly, the other element that's needed to make carbon offset schemes work is there needs to be a culture within those who are responsible for administering them of critiquing their own work, constant vigilance to ensure that the methods reflect reality, that the methods set baselines, set measurement protocols in a way that ensures integrity. These things change through time, so there needs to be that attitude, that culture that chases down errors, keeps up with market developments and ensures that the credits that come out of the end of the pipe are what they say they are. The final element that is crucial for these carbon schemes to have, carbon offset schemes, to have integrity is transparency. We need to have schemes where third parties, the public, any interested member of the public can see into the schemes, can see the basis for the baselines, the data behind projects. Now, in the case of Australia's ERF, these three elements have been missing. The Australian government has tried to use offsets across the economy. That's problem one, and particularly moved offsets into activities and project types where I think they're inappropriate and should not be used. The next thing is that the regulator and the other people responsible for the scheme have not had that culture. They've not embraced the culture of constantly critiquing their own work, being on top of it and being willing to admit errors and correct them quickly. Now, of course, I was involved in this scheme and must take some blame for it, and I do, but it's now important for that cultural change to occur so Australia's carbon market can be restored to what it should be. And the final element is that transparency. It's the Australian government's ERF is distinctly lacking in transparency. To give you an example, for our tree projects, which are a big part of the scheme, third parties are not allowed to see where these trees are. So we're handing out carbon credits for people to grow trees, yet the public can't see where these trees are. As a consequence of all these design flaws, we've got a carbon offset scheme in Australia where, on our analysis, somewhere in the order of 70 to 80% of all the credits that have been issued, so that's in the order of 70 to 80 million carbon credits, have been issued that do not represent real abatement, or they do not represent additional abatement. The three main project types that have dominated the scheme to date are, firstly, a landfill gas method, secondly, a thing called avoided deforestation, which is confined to a state in Australia called New South Wales, the western part of New South Wales, and the final one is a thing called human-induced regeneration, which is essentially a method that provides credits to people to change land management practices and thereby regenerate forests. Our analysis across those three project types shows that in relation to the landfill gas method, most of the credits have been generated by very large landfills that do not need them and certainly don't need as many credits as they're getting in order to be financially viable. In relation to the avoided deforestation method, it appears that the vast majority of the credits have gone to projects and to protect forests that were never going to be cleared anyway. And in relation to the human-induced regeneration method, it appears that vast numbers of credits are being issued to people to grow trees that are already there, and in cases where the trees are actually growing, would have grown anyway. It's incredibly disheartening to someone like me who's a believer in environmental markets, and I don't want to give the impression that offset markets should not be used, or even the Australian government's, the RF, should be shut down. There are ways to fix these issues and to restore integrity of the market and ensure all carbon offset markets have integrity, but people need to be willing to embrace the idea that offsets should only be used in certain circumstances, that offset markets need to be governed by a culture where correction of error is at the forefront of everybody's mind, and finally, that the carbon markets are defined by high transparency and a real willingness to invite third parties in rather than locking them out. I'll end it there, and I hope the rest of the event goes well, and if anybody wants to discuss any issues with me, please get in touch. Thanks very much.
Welcome back, everybody. So that was a kind of really grounding reality check from Professor McIntosh there, particularly having come from Davos and, as I said, heard about carbon offsets as a climate solution all over the place. So I think perhaps before proceeding, we can take a step back. Nathaniel, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about what carbon offsets are, and in particular, I mean, what you think that they can and can't achieve in light of Professor McIntosh's comments there. And perhaps also a comment on the current state of affairs of the voluntary carbon market in terms of the use of these offsets, the market size, and some projections. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much, Natasha, and thanks to Global Returns for organizing this panel, and I look forward to the conversation. And I'll just preface it by saying I know we'll come back to these issues around the importance of integrity, the importance of transparency. As you'll hear me say, I'm sure a number of times, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market was created precisely to try to get that in place for the voluntary carbon market. So we can come back to how we're doing that. But I agree with a lot of Professor McIntosh's concerns, and I think they can be addressed. But let me take a step back, as you say, because there are lots of different things. There's a lot of moving parts in the carbon, what's referred to as carbon offsets. I'll call carbon credits for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. And I'll try to be clear and also high level. So first of all, what do we mean by a carbon credit? A carbon credit, as I mean it, is a verified ton of emissions reduction or emissions removal, reduction or removal of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's expressed usually in a carbon dioxide equivalent. But as with the landfill gases that Professor McIntosh mentioned, sometimes it can be methane, it can be another gas, but it's always a reduction or removal from the atmosphere of greenhouse gases that cause climate change. And it's usually measured in a ton. Now, I use the word credit because credits can be used in lots of different ways. So one way they've historically been used is as an offset. In other words, as a way of offsetting emissions that may be increased somewhere else. So a factory that can't reduce its emissions, a factory that wants to sort of balance out its emissions in the past might have increased its emissions in the factory or not reduced them, and then purchased a credit as an offset. I think we're moving away from that sort of use. So we can come back to that during the discussion, because I think more and more, at least in the environmental community, people see carbon credits as a means of going above and beyond what companies do to reduce their own emissions in their value chains and supply chains. And that's a very important distinction. But let me also give the audience a sense of sort of where these credits are used. First, there's a set of markets in carbon markets that are really regulatory in nature, that are set up by governments. So Professor McIntosh mentioned the Australian system. There's a system called CORSIA, which is run by the International Civil Aviation Organization and is an offsetting scheme in that case for airlines with international flights. The state of California in the United States and the province of Quebec have a system that also allows carbon credits into their cap and trade or emissions trading markets. So there are some compliance systems that are set up by governments. Most of the growth, I think, and the sort of a lot of the attention in terms of carbon credits, or when people talk about carbon offsets, is in what's called the voluntary carbon market. And these are where firms, companies, private sector companies usually, are buying credits to meet their corporate commitments. And so I'm mostly going to be talking about that voluntary carbon market, but many of the issues that arise around quality would also arise in some of those other markets like the Australian one and CORSIA. Just to give a sense, the last year, in the past few years, the voluntary carbon market has been growing dramatically. So Ecosystem Marketplace is a group that tracks that, and the volume of voluntary carbon credits has roughly tripled just in the past few years. It reached roughly 300 million tons in 2021 last year, up from kind of around 100 million in 2019, excuse me. Now that's a drop in the bucket. Global emissions are 50 billion tons. So right now it's a drop in the bucket, but it's increasing rapidly. And there are projections that if done well and if done right, that voluntary market could scale up to being 1 billion or more tons within a few years. So we're on a rising trajectory in terms of demand, and that's really being driven by companies that are making commitments to be net zero. They're making commitments to do more in terms of fighting climate change. So let me end with, what's the potential here? What could be done? What does the world look like to somebody who thinks that the carbon market can be a force for good? Well, I think the fundamental potential of the carbon market, including the voluntary carbon market, is to help the world meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, to keep temperatures well under 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels, and try to get to 1.5 degrees, which is really the threshold where we know dangerous climate change kicks in, to provide a source of climate finance that can support sustainable development in developing countries, that can also support and provide other co-benefits like protecting biodiversity if done well, sustaining livelihoods, promoting adaptation and resilience. So I think there's real potential here for a well-designed carbon market to be a really important source of climate finance to help developing countries meet their targets under the Paris Agreement, be more ambitious going forward, really make significant emissions reductions and removals. If we can scale it up to 1 billion or more tons a year, that would be a significant part of the solution. But as I know we'll talk the rest of the time, in order to do that, we'll have to have a high integrity market. And so I know we'll come back to that issue.
Okay, thanks very much. It's hearing about the opportunities, and I think I'd like to turn now to some of the risks, which were touched on in Professor McIntosh's video, the environmental issues, as well as the risks associated with getting this wrong, which is effectively a net increase in emissions. And as Nathaniel pointed out, Professor McIntosh was talking about a compliance market. What we're talking about here is a voluntary market where faces similar, but if not more stark challenges in the sense that it lacks that regulatory oversight. So Jose Maria, your research has assessed carbon offset projects in a number of countries globally, including Brazil, Mexico, China, and Chile. What are your reactions to Professor McIntosh's comments and Nathaniel's, and what are your primary concerns with the offset market as currently constructed?
I'll start from Professor McIntosh's comment on the fact that it's very easy to get it wrong, to get things wrong. I think that's a right way to start, because it can lead us to focus on conditions or tools that would make things, that would help things not go wrong as easily. There's issues on environmental integrity, both from the side on whether these projects might affect other local environmental goods, let's say biodiversity, from, for example, afforestation projects, when there's an introduction of new species that are not necessarily adequate to the local ecosystem. There's also the environmental integrity issue of whether does it proper type of removal based on how long this removal project is going to stand, for how long does it going to store CO2, especially given climate change itself, and how there's more regions that are going to be suffering for more severe droughts and more forest fires, for example, as we've seen in places like Chile or the US itself. And there's also the fact of there being issues of social compatibility, where some of these projects actually end up locking in some local ecosystem in a development path that might not be the preferred choice of local stakeholders. And a very concrete example of this is when we have a project, let's say afforestation or reforestation, that signs a contract for 20, 50, 100 years. And that means that local communities might not be able to develop other productive activities that would have been compatible with climate change fighting, let's say the development of, I don't know, cocoa or coffee projects within healthy environments. So one way in which we need to make sure private carbon markets or voluntary carbon markets develop is in accordance to local political priorities. And I find this very common to not talk about governments when we're talking about voluntary markets. And one of the ideas behind this notion of voluntary markets is precisely that these are not regulated as markets, that these are kind of parallel to government interventions, but they shouldn't necessarily be. So these might not be markets that are regulated as a market for government compliance purposes, but there's certainly in most countries, in all countries, and if not, we actually have to work on that, a number of climate and developmental policies that should be complied with, or where these initiatives have to be well aligned with. And we've seen many cases in developing countries where governments actually proactively take steps to avoid or stop some of these projects from happening, precisely because of concerns about many of these offsetting or carbon credit projects. I actually agree with the terminology presented by Nat. We should be talking about carbon credits because there's more than offsetting behind some of these purchases. But the point is, we've seen governments moving to avoid some of these initiatives to develop in certain regions within their countries, precisely because they don't seem to match local development priorities. There's obviously other stakeholders that might not be well represented by governments, but governments are ultimately one very strong form, the most important form of public representation, and their views should somehow be included, because they institutionalize those in, I don't know, national determined contributions to the UNFCCC or other forms of developmental or environmental protection plans.
Okay, thanks. So there's a couple of points there I think keen to come back to you at the end, but I think first we'll just turn to Mark now. Mark, if you could comment on or share your reactions to both what Nathaniel, Professor McIntosh and Jose Maria have said. And we're also keen to hear more about your work at Client Earth and how this sits with the sphere of carbon offsets, carbon credits, and in terms of climate solutions. Thank you.
Okay, well, I pretty much agree with everything that's been said, and the fundamental problem here is that we have a bunch of volunteers or voluntary markets with no real oversight, no real standards, and an awful lot of snake oil being sold very cheaply, so that people can say they're carbon neutral. And and talking about the culture point, a lot of people just don't even understand the idea of durability or how long it takes to remove carbon. So you buy a tree, offset, and then somebody says, "Oh, there's your ton taken out," and actually no, it's going to take 50 or 60 years for that ton taken out. Oh, and by the way, it burnt down 30 years later because of climate change. So at the moment, apart from the fact that there are no standards, there's not enough real proper demand, there's not enough real proper supply, and nobody really knows what the hell they're doing. It's absolutely perfect. So what we have to do is massively professionalize the whole thing. Now, what's good about the voluntary markets is they've at least started to get people into a conversation. So it's a bit like when you start to get fit. You might be a bit rubbish at running, you might be a bit rubbish at weight training, and basically the world is at the moment when it comes to carbon removal. But at least the conversations now happen. So these criticisms of what's going on are useful. There's just they're 20 years too late. And also, I'm very worried about the term offset, and the term that we use, offsets, to also create credits for reductions, because reductions is just another mitigation, and all the science says we have to do all of that mitigation anyway, everything, and the plans of most governments aren't enough. And on top of that, we have to permanently remove 20 gigatons of carbon. Not offset it, not stop. So the thing is, like, if I put out a ton of carbon, I can offset it by saying this person over here is not going to remove the ton of carbon that they would have removed. So there would have been two, but now there's still 1 ton of carbon going into the atmosphere. So we really have to make a very different distinction between offsets and removals, which is, if I put a ton out, I've got to durably and quickly pay somebody to take that ton back out and store that. Now, you can store it in all sorts of places: soil, trees, rocks, etc., etc. But there are no standards and there's no pricing that really helps us understand that's part of the problem I'm trying to solve. And this leads on to the work sort of Client Earth does. So what Client Earth is really kind of we're not doing so much work in this space, but what Client Earth is kind of like, is the enforcer. So there's actually a lot of really great environmental and business law out there. It's just that nobody enforces it, because who would? So we come along and kind of go, oh yeah, you're breaking the law. And at the moment, for instance, we're taking the UK government to court because they signed a climate law in 2008 that said we will be net zero by 2050, and we've looked at their net zero plan and we said it's completely incompatible. So you're breaking your own law. We've just taken Shell to court, the board for Shell, because their entire strategy is completely inconsistent with the Paris goals. And as shareholders, as we are of the company, we believe this is a very bad strategy for running the company in the future that's coming. So what we kind of do is go around and we kind of sort of enforce stuff that's already there. But this is the big problem with the carbon markets. There aren't proper standards. There's no proper enforcement. The standards that are out there are kind of made by people who have a vested interest in them. So, for instance, Vero is one of the carbon offset standards. A recent investigation found that a bunch of the stuff that they had verified as being good was no good at all. So we really need to professionalize the whole thing. That would be my big point, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark. And I think, we'll turn it back to Nat now. So we've heard a lot about the kind of concerns that are out there. You've also mentioned them yourself. Could you talk a bit about how the Integrity Council plans to address these, and also similar efforts that might be underway on the demand side? And I think also to Mark's point there that that there are currently no standards, or that there are, the standards that are out there. There are certain vested interests, and there has been some criticism around the Integrity Council of the sort of stakeholders in the council, and whether sort of writing your own, marking your own homework type thing. Could you just comment as well on that, and what the Integrity Council is doing to address these concerns?
Sure. Yeah. So look, let me start by saying, I mean, this is a great conversation, and I really appreciate the comments of JOSE Maria and Mark. I will say, I think it's a little unfair to say that there's no professionalization of the market. I do think we need more oversight and better standards, and that's what the Integrity Council is about. And I don't think that the existing standards organizations have done everything right, but I think the people that are working at those organizations really are. I mean, they're trying to do the right thing. I think many of them are real professionals who've been there for a long time. There is a structure around it of verification. There's a lot of questions in the chat. Can we measure these things? How do we measure them? And we can, and we do. I mean, there are really good ways to measure, for example, treat carbon biomass, do remote sensing and satellite sensing of forests, and measure with a fair amount of accuracy and precision carbon biomass and so on in trees. So there are, and that's just one example. So there are good ways to measure. What I would say the challenge is we don't have enough confidence that all the credits that are out there are good. So there are some credits that are out there that I think are really good. There are some standards that are really doing a great job, and there are some that are not. And right now it's hard to tell the difference unless you're a real expert and you go out and you hire a consultant to do a massive study. So for most companies coming in, they want to do the right thing. They're not actually looking to increase their own emissions and offset them elsewhere. They're looking to do something on top of what they're doing in their own supply chains and operations. So beyond reducing their own emissions, what else can they do? How can they contribute to climate? Maybe they can invest in emissions reductions elsewhere, help protect the Amazon forest, whatever it is. But to do that, they need to know that they're getting something that has high quality. And right now, we just don't have that assurance. And so that's what the Integrity Council is designed to do. So the Integrity Council was created late last year in order to really establish what we call a threshold quality standard for carbon credits of all types. So we're looking across all different types of carbon credits. This could be renewable energy. It could be reduced tropical deforestation. It could be better household energy to get rid of dirty cook stoves. It could be landfills, that potentially things like that Professor McIntosh mentioned. It could be new agricultural techniques that capture carbon in the soil. It could be technologies that pull carbon out of the sky. Essentially, there's an expert panel at the heart of the Integrity Council that's overseen by a governing board. And that expert panel is looking at essentially across the board, look at all those methodologies. Let's come up with a set of core carbon principles that apply across carbon crediting methodologies, and then apply those to the existing methodologies and say, these methodologies and standards meet that high threshold quality standard, these don't. Here's a way to distinguish between what's good and bad. That's the goal of the Integrity Council. We're going to be rolling out those core carbon principles and the assessment framework for methodologies. We're going to be putting those out for public consultation in July. We've had some of the world's top experts, including some folks who are quite skeptical of carbon markets, have been working on those draft principles. We've shared them with a small set of stakeholders to get feedback. So we're really going through this process with public consultation. We expect in July by the end of the year, we'll have those core carbon principles in place, with the goal of promoting integrity on the quality, on the sort of supply side. And our mantra is, if we build integrity and we ensure integrity of the market, that's the first step. And then we can get the scale that will make a difference for the climate. Let me briefly talk about other aspects of integrity, because when I think about what does it mean to have a high integrity voluntary carbon market, that integrity on the supply side, in other words, the credits mean what they say they mean, they actually represent real additional reductions or removals of emissions. That's an important point, but it's not the only one. There's also a piece that we think of as market integrity. So having transparency in transactions, having real visibility and liquidity in a market that you can believe in. I think Professor McIntosh talked about that. That's really important. And then there's demand side integrity, which is really, how do these credits get used? And this goes back to the heart of the question about, do we call them credits or offsets? I keep calling them credits because I think they should be used as a means of doing more above and beyond what's already being done, so that companies that have climate commitments can do more to reduce emissions and contribute to the climate fight. And so there's a group called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative that is putting together guidelines based on input from civil society to say, here's what an appropriate claim looks like. Here's how these carbon credits should be used by companies. Here's when it's okay for a company to say they're net zero and when it's not. So there's an associated set on the demand side to make sure that when the credits are used, they're used in a way that is understandable, that is clear, that is honest and authentic. And that's a complement to the work the Integrity Council is doing.
Thanks. So just a quick follow up on that. You mentioned the role of the VCMI around guidelines for appropriate claims. In my day job as a reporter, I often see kind of press releases coming in around new carbon ventures that are claiming to be aligned with these core carbon principles that the Integrity Council is going to issue later in the year. So effectively, we're seeing claims against principles that haven't yet been published. So could you just touch on how you will prevent actors misusing the core carbon principles to greenwash their operations?
Yeah, that's very important to us because, of course, once we get these core carbon principles in place and we have that assessment methodology, it only works if we're able to really make sure that that label, effectively that sort of kite mark, if you will, is accurately applied. I mean, look, I think right now there are a handful of folks that are trying to get ahead of the system, but we think it's really important to do this right and to take the time to put the CCPs together with expert input and with public input. So it's very premature for folks to say, oh, well, I know where the CCPs are going to go. I'm not even going to say that because we need to let that public process play out. So that's premature. Once we get those CCPs in place, we will be, the organization is going to last. It's going to, the goal is to be able to say, here's what the label is, and here's who can apply that label, that CCP label of quality, and we'll be sure that that doesn't get applied to standards or methodologies or carbon credits that don't meet the standard.
Okay, thanks. I think before turning to questions, we'll just take a stand back now to kind of summarize the conversation. So this is a question to all panelists, but perhaps Mark, you can begin. So just what would, from your perspective, what is the future of the voluntary carbon market, and effectively can carbon offsets ever be part of a credible net zero strategy, or are efforts to combat climate change better placed elsewhere? And if so, where?
Well, first, I think we just have to tidy up the language, really. So offsets is a term that doesn't mean, nobody quite understands what it means. So we have to get rid of the term offsets for a start. We have to tidy up the language, and we have to tell them that we have to explain to people what the difference is between mitigation, so you're paying somebody not to do some emissions, and actual removal. So we've got to get, so there's a wonderful project called Rethinking Removals, run by Dr. Gabriel Walker, which is basically trying to tidy up all of that language at the moment. Because until people actually understand what they're talking about, we get all these confusions. So if we get to that point where people understand the difference between a removal and a mitigation, and why one is more important than the other, that's important. Then we have to have this, that people need to understand, that how durable is it? That carbon removal, does it stay in the soil for 5 years? Does it stay in the rock for 100,000 years? And how quickly does that removal happen? Do I buy it now and my tongue gets removed over the next 30 years, or do I buy it now and it goes back into an oil well, tomorrow? So until we have an actual proper set of language where people can actually understand what they're buying, then we're going nowhere. So the first thing, but once we get that in place, then it becomes a lot easier to have the conversation like we're having now. Saying, okay, I understand, I want to buy removal. So the company I'm setting up, we're working with touring artists, we're working with major sort of musical acts, because they want to be able to stand on stage and talk about climate, but they can't at the moment because they feel like they're hypocrites, and being a hypocrite in front of your own audience is commercial suicide. But if you're going on tour, you don't want your carbon to be removed 30 years from now. You want it to be removed by the time you've been on tour or very soon afterwards. And that's expensive at the moment. So these markets can work, but we've got to really tidy up the language and get those standards in place such that I can look at my ticket and it says your ticket has been carbon removed. I can click on a QR code and it will say, yes, your carbon is being removed by this method, this is its durability, and this is how quickly it's being done. And there's some wonderful people at Carbon Finance Labs who are kind of working on that stuff. So yes, all the parts are there, but really right now what's happening is the language is just so ridiculous and hard for people to understand, and an offset can mean one thing or another, and a credit can mean one thing or another. Until we get that sorted, I don't think we are going anywhere really, but I think we will get that sorted, and I think that conversation is happening right now because of the work of the wonderful people on this panel as well. So I think once we get that language sorted out, and you as a journalist as well are probably helping us do that as well, that will be hugely important, because we're all talking at cross purposes at the moment. Poor companies are out there. I mean, I've got recording artists coming to me saying, I want to offset stuff, I want to plant some trees, and we go, well, oh my God. And we have to spend 2 or 3 days with them explaining to them, how carbon works and the carbon cycle, and all the difference in removal and offset and a tree and enhanced weathering and direct air capture. So, we have a massive education job to do, which is why everybody on this panel is really important, including yourself.
Thanks, Mark. I'll turn to JOSE Maria for your comments, please. You're on mute.
Obviously. So I think I'm going to give a very, I'm going to move in an opposite direction to Mark, because I think his response was very good. And also to deal with one issue that came up in the question, which is Article 6. So Article 6 refers to the Paris Agreement component that refers to, among other things, essentially the possibility of these carbon markets, international, regional, national, to somehow contribute to the international global commitment to maintain the global change in temperature below the 2 degrees, significantly below the 2 degrees, and aiming to 1.5 degrees. And the importance of that article to our discussions is that it might lead governments, or it should lead governments, to put some order into how private markets should work. So the progress hasn't been steadfast. There's many hurdles to go through before there's something concrete that we can actually benefit from. But this is kind of a new, this is a different avenue of potential positive intervention into ordering voluntary carbon markets. And one of the ways in which this might be useful, and I think it's important to have it in mind, is that some voluntary carbon markets are actually ancillary to regulated carbon markets. So some participants might say, well, I want more, I want to be as sure as possible on the integrity of these certificates or these credits. I'll buy the same certificates that would be allowed into the California carbon market. Even if I'm not going to use it for the California carbon market, if a project can comply with those rules, then I'm happy to buy those. So that's kind of an interesting phenomenon, as we see better national regulation on these, voluntary carbon markets or voluntary markets in general will benefit from also kind of borrowing from that regulatory infrastructure. And ideally, the international political process within the Paris Agreement should also support that. Now, I think there's many voices that are very incredulous on whether there's going to be that those political agreements at the international level in a timely fashion to help shape purely voluntary private carbon markets. So let's keep track on those developments as well. And I'll just add one more point on this issue of professionalization, because I think it's an interesting. I think it's relevant that it came up in the discussion, because this also is important from the perspective of capacity building in actors beyond the carbon markets themselves. So a lot of the transparency is intended for other actors that don't participate in the market, let's say universities, to be able to monitor for environmental integrity or compliance. So then it is, and because many of the projects are being developed in developing countries or are deployed in developing countries, then one would think that it's really feasible and productive and positive for a lot of these kind of compliance work from a third party, many times on an academic voluntary basis, to be done in developing countries. So building these capabilities, kind of widely distributed capabilities within wider academic or technical communities outside Europe and the US would really improve the general ecosystem of voluntary markets.
So maybe I can just add two quick things to the chat, because or to this conversation. I know, Natasha, you have some other questions, but one is I've been looking at the chat. The chat is terrific. There's a lot of back and forth, but let me just take a step back, because I think there are some folks in the audience who are still wondering, what is it that a carbon credit, what are these carbon credits in the first place? Because at base, because I know there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of, we all talk about, we use the sort of the terms, but basically what we're talking about is a project or an initiative that purports to reduce emissions relative to what they otherwise would have been, or to remove it. So this could be a renewable energy project, like setting up a wind turbine instead of a coal plant. The wind turbine doesn't emit any carbon dioxide. And if that is really done instead of the coal plant, that's a good thing. It represents avoided emissions. But then you have to figure out, would the coal plant really have been built? What would have happened in the alternative? And those are all the issues that get into, is that really a valid carbon credit? Same thing if you think about protecting forest. Professor McIntosh mentioned, would the forest have really been cleared? In some places like the Amazon, the forest is under real constant threat. And so I would argue there's very high quality emissions reductions associated with protecting that forest. But in other places, the forest might not be under threat. And so those are tough questions. And those are the kind of questions that lie behind. When we talk about integrity of the quality, are these carbon credits real? Are they additional in terms of adding emissions reductions beyond what would have otherwise happened? That's a lot of the heart of it. And the expert panel that I mentioned for the Integrity Council is sort of stocked with people that have spent their lives and their careers studying all those things. What does a baseline mean? How do you calculate whether the project would have happened or not? So those are the things that are the sort of nuts and bolts and the nitty gritty behind this. They are technical, but I think you can get them right. And then the other thing to say is there's already a whole system of third-party verifies, there's satellite measurement, there's a whole series. I mean, we need to improve the measurement in many ways, but there's a whole system out there to measure things, to verify that people are doing what they say they're doing. So if you can get those methodologies right, if you can get the baselines right, and then you make sure that these credits are being used in a way that's authentic and genuine and honest, and that they're not being people aren't making claims they shouldn't be making, that's when I say you have a reasonably high integrity carbon market. So maybe that helps explain a little bit. Let me just provide one. I agree with everything Mark said about the importance of getting the language straight. And I think that's really important. That's part of what I think the Integrity Council is trying to do, and part of what the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative is doing. One point I want to make, and this I'm going to make with my other hat on. I run a climate NGO called the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. So this is me speaking with that hat on, because the Integrity Council is really looking across the board at every kind of carbon credit. But I want to take a little bit of an issue with the idea that removals are better than emissions reductions. And so let me just explain this very clearly. In mid-century, the science says that if we're going to stabilize the temperature of the global temperature at safe levels, by mid-century, we need to be at net zero globally, which net zero emissions, which means we need to reduce emissions from 50 billion a year today to as close to zero as we can. And then, as Mark said, we need to remove emissions from the atmosphere and remove carbon from the atmosphere to get down to zero. And so at that point, we can't be just trading emissions reductions around. We have to be reducing as much as we can and removing the rest. That's absolutely true. Today, however, in 2022, there are opportunities to reduce emissions that if we don't take those opportunities and we don't finance them, we will blow through 2 degrees. And one example is protecting rainforests, the tropical rainforests of the world. The Amazon rainforest, Indonesia, the Central Congo. If we don't protect those rainforests today, we have no hope of making 2 degrees. And I would say, we could differ, but I would say one of the ways, not the only, but one of the ways, the solutions to protecting them is a high integrity carbon market that channels private sector finance into protecting the forest. That's reducing emissions today. That's really valuable, even though over time, we need to develop the technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So I just want to make that point about removals versus reductions. It comes up a lot. I think today we need both. We need to move towards a world where we're removing 20 billion tons a year. But in the meantime, we need to reduce as much as we can.
Yeah, I completely agree that it's both and. It's both and, but the problem is, I think, with the markets is the language is such that people are equating them to be the same, and they're not, and we need to understand why they're not, and then perhaps have 2 separate markets, one for mitigation credits and one for removal credits.
And so just really quickly on that, Natasha, I know you have some, but I will say, so the Integrity Council, now back with that hat on, the Integrity Council is providing a threshold quality standard that will apply to all methodologies. But we're also going to be identifying particular traits that people might care about. So there will be a tag, an attribute tag, if you will, for removals. So if a company wants to buy removals and it wants to make sure it's buying removals because it wants to promote that technology, it'll be able to do that. We would say the quality is the same with these reduction credits, but if you want to buy removals, you can do that. If you want to buy nature-based credits around forests or agriculture, you can do that. If you want to buy credits with especially high other traits, you can do that as well.
Thanks, both. So I'm just going to turn briefly to questions from the audience because we're running out of time. So we've got a couple of questions on recent movements in, say, the regulatory space. So one is around how the US Securities and Exchange Commission's newly proposed climate disclosures rule will affect the voluntary carbon markets, if at all. And on a similar topic, and I guess this one is for you, Nathaniel, do you see a potential conflict or alignment between the work of the VCMI, not the Integrity Council, and the SBTI, so the Science Based Targets Initiative's net zero standard, which is an increasingly important question for corporates, says the participant?
Yeah. I'll try to answer both quite quickly because I know we have other questions. So the first question, yes, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, which regulates securities markets, has come out with a proposed rule that it covers a lot of disclosure from companies, but one of the things they would require of public companies is to disclose their use of carbon credits. The Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which governs futures and derivatives markets in the US, is also looking at that. UK regulators are looking at this, and the European Commission, the European Union's regulators have a proposed rule as well around this. So there's lots of activity from those financial markets regulators to promote real transparency and disclosure around carbon credits, and also they're starting to look at what the quality of those credits are. I think that's a really good thing. I don't think this is a voluntary market, as Jose Maria said, but it can only benefit from transparency. I think that's something we're all saying. So I think that's a really good thing. And I also think as those regulators maybe start to look at what constitutes high quality, the hope is that the work of the Integrity Council can inform them. So we can say, hey, look, we've done the work, we've done the homework, here's what quality looks like. And that can be useful to those financial market regulators as they try to sift through kind of what's wheat and what's chaff in the voluntary carbon market. The second question, lots of acronyms around here. The Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, is one of the leading efforts to define what is a emissions trajectory that a company should be on. So if a company is saying, we're making a net zero commitment, a voluntary commitment, we're going to be net zero by 2050 or carbon neutral by this date, and there are lots of companies doing that, you need to know, well, what's a trajectory of emissions between now and 2050 that is consistent with that commitment? And that's what SBTI is doing. They're a group of organizations that have come together with a lot of civil society input to sort of plot those trajectories. And so that's very complementary with everything else we're talking about. In a sense, the goal is we get to a point where a company that wants to make a commitment and do so transparently can use a emissions trajectory that's set up by SBTI or some other organization, a science-based target. It can then follow the guidelines of the Voluntary Carbon Market initiative to talk about, to use authentic, honest claims about how it's using credits. And when it uses credits, it will use credits that are approved, that meet the core carbon principles of the Integrity Council. That's where we're hoping to get to. And that would be a pretty high integrity or a very high integrity carbon market.
Thanks. Did either of Mark or Jose Maria, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll steal this idea from Mark probably, because this is about clientele and their job. And I think the importance of some of this regulation is not about the regulators observing or studying the compliance of these companies, but just having that regulation so that other stakeholders and interested parties can take these cases to courts. So, or other forms of authorities. So maybe it's going to be local authorities, maybe it's going to be consumer protection authorities that can rely on these new pieces of regulation to take companies to court for misrepresenting their climate commitments or their climate activities. So, and I think that's very powerful, specifically or especially in countries that have really good legal systems for consumer protections. And I think we're going to see a lot of that in the US and in Europe.
The only other thing I'd add is that, it's always both and for me. We have to have extreme mitigation and we have to build a removals industry at scale very quickly. And we have to do both now quickly because we've left it too late. So, one of the things that worries me sometimes about this debate is somebody will say, well, if we can't concentrate on removals because then that'll take away attention from mitigation. And it's like, well, the science says we've got to do both, whether you like it or not. So what we need is, everybody to come together and go, like the work Nathaniel is doing and Jose Maria doing on making sure we're understanding each other and going like, how can I help you with removals? How can I help you with mitigation? How do we get these market mechanisms work so that we're pumping on all cylinders with maximum force, and how do we get people like Bloomberg to help educate, the reader about what's good and what's bad, because we've just left it too late now. But I'm always rather heartened by Leonard Bernstein's quote, which is to achieve great things, two other things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time. Well, I think we have the beginnings of a plan, and people like Nathaniel and JOSE Maria are helping us, and we certainly don't have enough time. So that's where we are.
Right, thanks all. Thanks for those closing remarks, Mark. And I'm going to hand it back to Jack now to wrap up.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Natasha, for guiding such a really interesting conversation today. Thanks to our panelists for joining us and for your contributions. And of course, thanks again to Professor McIntosh for providing such a thought-provoking introduction to the event. And thanks as well for everyone who's watched. Finally, a quick reminder that this event was hosted by the Global Returns Project. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're a UK registered climate charity, and we're offering a critical complement to any individual's financial planning or any business's sustainability strategy. That complement is our Global Returns portfolio, a selection of diverse, effective, and scalable not-for-profits tackling climate change. You can learn more and contribute on our website today, globalreturnsproject.earth. And businesses, we'd be particularly excited to speak with you about contributing to our portfolio as a complement to your sustainability strategy. We don't charge any fees to individuals or businesses, and we don't take any deductions on contributions. Please do get in touch, and thank you once again to everyone for this fantastic event. Have a great day.